Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Politics in the Time of Coronavirus at its new time, an evening, almost prime time event. Please stay tuned at the end of today's program, and I'll give you a quick update on some terrific upcoming programs that we have both this week, next week, and the weeks to come. For those of you who want to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. So Dan, never a dull moment on the headlines.
Well, you can say that again, Kim. As you can see, I'm still getting used to our new time slot, but I'm ready to go. And I'm really excited for our new experiment, and I hope it ends up working for our audience members too.
Well, our audience can fill out the survey that comes in the email after this. And again, this was in response to so many requests for us to change the time to accommodate new working schedules. So fingers crossed. But let's go to those topics, Dan. You've got Biden versus the coronavirus, high stakes for the president. Will climate change make it through Congress? And of course, we always keep room for news from the daily headlines. And all we've been hearing about all day is about Bob Woodward's new book, Peril, and General Milley. So I'm sure you're going to get questions on that as well. It may have to be its own program.
Well, we may have to talk about not just Bob Woodward and Robert Costa's book, but the number of books that are now coming out on the Trump administration. And I suspect you're right, though, Kim, even before we get around to scheduling a topic on a program, on a future program on that, my guess is we'll probably get at least a couple of questions tonight. We'll see if Jessica picks them out.
So take it away, Dan. We need all the time with you we can.
Well, thank you very much, Kim. And as always, thanks so much to all of you for joining us. And we're especially grateful to have you here at our new evening time slot. I do want to politely correct one thing that Kim said. She said that we are almost in prime time. And that's true on the West Coast. But one of the reasons for you West Coasters who wanted to know why we're doing this at 5 o'clock and not later in the evening, it's because over the months we've established quite a following on the East Coast and in the Central Time Zone as well. And some of our feedback has been that if we scheduled any later than 5 o'clock Pacific time, 8 o'clock Eastern, that might create some challenges. So hopefully this is a good middle ground for everyone. We'll see how it goes. But with that, let's get into our topics. And we're going to start right away with Biden and the coronavirus. So let's start with something I think we can all acknowledge. It hasn't been a very good month for Joe Biden. The polls show that voters have overwhelmingly disapproved of the manner in which his administration conducted its withdrawal from Afghanistan, even while supporting the underlying decision. He's dealing with wildfires out here in the West, hurricanes in the East, and what's beginning to look like is a greater likelihood of congressional gridlock in Washington. The economy seems to be stagnating a bit. And school reopenings around the country have been marked by all sorts of confusion and controversy too. And the impact has been seen in the president's poll numbers, which have been dropping slightly over the summer, but more so over the last few weeks. And of course, what this all traces back to, or what almost all of this traces back to, certainly some of these crises have emerged for other reasons, but the big problem, both for the president and the country, is COVID-19. Now, it was only a few months ago when most of us, myself included, believed that vaccines would make us invulnerable. But the emergence of the Delta variant and the speed with which it has swept through the unvaccinated populations has led to immense increases in the number of cases, hospitalizations, and death around the country. And even though the outbreak hasn't reached anywhere near the heights that we experienced last summer, it has now outpaced the rates we were seeing, It hasn't reached anywhere near the heights we experienced last winter, but actually it's not. We're now outpacing the rates that we're seeing in the country during the summer of 2020. Now, the effect on Biden's poll numbers has been predictable. And while other matters, like some of those I mentioned earlier, have had some impact, overall, Biden's popularity among independent voters in particular has fallen dramatically, both because of specific concerns about the virus and its subsequent impact on the economy, but also because these challenges have begun to undermine what has long been Biden's core fundamental message of competence and experience. And that's a message that elevated him to the White House last year and that sustained him through his first several months in office. So think of it this way. Biden is actually right now facing three parallel crises: a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a political crisis. And once again, all three of these can be traced right back to COVID. Now, Biden and his advisors have come to realize that as long as the country is not making more progress in the fight against the virus, the rest of his policy agenda is going to become even more difficult for him to achieve. And if he's not able to reverse his slide in the polls, then the likelihood of Democrats maintaining their very small congressional majorities in next year's midterm elections are going to get much smaller too. So Biden needed to do something dramatic. He needed to shake up the landscape to lay out a far more aggressive strategy for fighting the pandemic than he had to date, even if it meant risking a very strong pushback from his political opponents. Now, for months now, the president has been encouraging conservative voters in red states and rural areas to get vaccinated. And he's made some progress, but it's been fairly incremental. Now, for reasons having to do with both public health and political survival, Biden's realized that it's time for him to get much tougher, much louder, and much angrier. And if you watch the president's address to the nation last Thursday night when he laid out his new vaccine plan and his new broader COVID-19 plan, you notice that toughness, you notice that volume, and you certainly notice that anger. And what he laid out was a six-pronged strategy for fighting the virus. 5 of the 6 prongs, while substantively important, are getting very little attention from the political class, at least, not surprisingly. Booster shots, school openings, increased testing, small business loans, and improved care for those with COVID are all important steps which will provide some health benefits and perhaps some political benefits too. But the big ticket item for Biden was his call for vaccine mandates, not just for government employees and contractors, but for tens of millions of Americans who work for private sector companies that have more than 100 employees. His vaccine mandates for government employees no longer even allow for the option of testing, which was an alternative that most state and local mandates had allowed. And his order was accompanied by, I think he'd agree, some fairly antagonistic language toward the unvaccinated. For months, Joe Biden has tried to be calm and encouraging, to try to gradually prod the unvaccinated to get the shots. Last Thursday night, that was gone. And what we saw was an exasperated and an angry president who was very clear has finally had enough. So I've gone on long enough. It's time to get you guys into the action. So Claire, can we post the first question for our group? What do all of you think about this? What was Biden's primary goal with these new mandates? Was it to confront health challenges? That is, to get more people to take the vaccine to stop the spread of the virus? Was it the economic challenges, the ongoing economic difficulties we're having as a result of the virus? Or was this primarily something he did in order to reverse his political fortunes? Or finally, would you say that it was all of the above? Let's see what our group has to say on this, Claire. A not a surprising answer at all. 79%, more than 3/4 of you, felt that it was some combination of the above. But even among those of you who picked one, it's very interesting. Roughly 3 times as many of you said that this was a proposal made primarily for health challenges over political challenges. Very interesting. But again, the consensus seems to be all of the above. So let's move from motivations to substance. And Claire, let's move right away to our second question if we can. On a substantive basis, regardless of why you think Biden made this new proposal, next question is, what do you think about it? Do you agree with Biden's decision on the vaccine mandates? Option 1, yes, I agree, because we need to move more aggressively. Option number 2, yes, we do need to move, but this has been too slow. He should have done this a long time ago. He should have done this earlier. He waited too long. Or third, no, I don't agree with the president. Forcing people to get vaccines is wrong and it's a violation of their rights. So once again, let's see what our group has to say. Now look at that. By a rough, almost a 3-to-1 margin, well, I would go even further than that. Almost all of you, more than 90% of you, believe that it was the right decision on Biden's part. Interestingly, about 1/4 of you said he should have done this previously, that he shouldn't have waited this long before moving more aggressively. But more than 2/3 of you say this is exactly the right time to do it. And a very small minority say this is not something he should have done at all. Now, we know from our previous polling that our group does tend to lean somewhat to the left of the overall electorate. And while we have some conservatives that make up our group, it is a smaller number than we find in the country as a whole. And so the White House staff knew going into this, they knew that the Republican base would be furious about this. Republican office holders and conservative leaders would just go crazy. And they did. Republican politicians across the country vowed to fight the mandate, and they threatened lawsuits. But this is something Biden and his team knew was coming. They recognized that along with the surge in cases over the last few months has come a very similar type of growth in the level of resentment that those who've been vaccinated in this country are feeling toward those who resisted or refused the shot. So several months ago, just like Biden was more understanding, so were most of us. And now that Delta has come back, public opinion polls show that the vaccinated are becoming increasingly frustrated and incredibly angry toward those who haven't taken the vaccines. And Biden's team understands that Donald Trump's strongest loyalists are never going to come around on this issue. And they've decided that picking a fight on vaccines with Republican political leaders could be a very effective strategy in regaining their footing with the political center. Because those same swing voters who have moved away from Biden over the last month or two, well, they're tired of the coronavirus too. And so maybe for the president, picking a fight with the vaccine resistors can allow Biden to win back those lost independents and get his presidency back on track. So I'm going to ask you guys a political question. We've talked about motives. We've talked about the substance of the decision. Now let's talk about the ramifications of the vaccine mandate. Claire? Yeah. So what do you think is going to happen? Who do you think Biden's new vaccine mandates will help most in next year's midterm elections? Does it primarily help the president and his party? Option 2, does it generally help the Republicans and mandate opponents? Or third, is it both equally? Let's see what we get. Very interesting. Roughly 2/3 of you think that this more aggressive action is going to help Biden in winning back the political center. 14% of you, a small number, but a noticeable percentage, believe that it's going to backfire and mandate opponents, if I interpret these numbers correctly, will become that much more voted to turn out against the president's party. And then 18% of you say, it'll be both equally. So we'll revisit this question going forward. But for now, we see that our group's leaning pretty decidedly that this was the right decision for Biden to make. But it is a risk. It's a risk that Biden had to take. White House officials know that Biden was elected to contain the virus. And if he's not successful with that, his entire presidency is in trouble. And we saw your results to the earlier question when you said he was responding much more to a health crisis than an economic crisis. Because once again, for Joe Biden, everything flows from COVID. And as I was saying a minute ago, by acknowledging and then channeling the very deep anger that many vaccinated Americans feel toward the unvaccinated, Biden has decided, you know what? I'm never going to win over most of those vaccine refusers. There are some who are reluctant, who are potentially swing voters. But for those hard-line opponents, Biden has said they're never going to vote for me. They're never going to vote for my Democratic Party's candidates. And so those diplomatic overtures just aren't worth the time and effort anymore. Now it's time to be more confrontational. Now, the key to public opinion on this issue is remembering that most voters are vaccinated. The polling suggests that Biden might not face as much backlash as Republicans hope, especially, and this is the most important factor of all, especially if COVID caseloads begin to go down over the next several months. One other consideration, or one other thing to keep in mind, and then we'll move on. The next fight on vaccinations, watch for this, is a huge brawl is currently brewing over whether airlines should mandate vaccines for their passengers. Now, as I said earlier, this vaccine mandate covers all medium and large sized businesses in America, all those with more than 100 employees. And every major airline in the country obviously fits into that category. So going forward, all of those airline employees, including pilots and flight attendants, are going to have to be vaccinated. And what we're about to see now is an argument about whether there should be vaccines for passengers, vaccine mandates for passengers too. And we'll revisit that question in a future webinar and talk about it in more depth and detail going forward. But keep your eyes open, because this is what's coming next. And just like on other issues, it's always easier to impose mandates on someone else. The same thing holds here. For those of us who are vaccinated, it's not that hard or that controversial to say, oh yeah, those other people must get vaccinated. Well, when it moves into our daily lives, this issue gets a little bit more complicated. So let's watch this debate as it moves forward. But for right now, let's move on. And we're going to talk about our next issue, our second of two topics today. And before we get into it at all, because I took so much time getting to the polling questions on topic one, let's get to our first question right away on topic two. Claire, thank you very much. So what's more important for the Democratic reconciliation package? Is it funding for climate change legislation? Number two, is it funding for healthcare priorities? Third, is it funding for other policy priorities? There's an awful lot that's covered in the $3.5 trillion bill. Or fourth, should the biggest priority be preventing the tax increases from getting too big and potentially having an adverse effect on the economy? So my guess is a lot of you would like to choose all three of the first options. And we are tempted to give that as a choice, all A, B, and C. But we want you to choose. We want to force a decision here. So if the package does end up shrinking, which in fact it might, and some of that money comes out of that legislative reconciliation package, what's most important to you? Money for climate change, money for healthcare, money for other issues? And look at that. Wow. 44%, not quite half, but a pretty strong plurality, think that money for climate change, to fight climate change, should come first, even if it means reductions in funding for healthcare. 19% of you, almost 1/5, say no way. The money for healthcare needs to come first. 17%, not all that different, just a little bit under 1/5, see other things in that budget package that you want to see prioritized. And 20% of you, exactly 1/5, are concerned about the tax increases getting too big. So let's talk about climate change and Congress. Because when Biden ran for president last year, the issue of climate change didn't get a lot of attention in his campaign versus Trump. It's obviously a critically important issue, especially to Democratic voters. But remember that Biden's focus last year in the general election was on winning in Rust Belt states like Pennsylvania and Michigan. And so he didn't want to put too much emphasis on climate change at the risk of upsetting voters whose livelihoods depend on fossil fuels. But this year, especially through his budget negotiations with Congress, it's very clear that this issue is a really big deal for Biden. And in addition to large amounts of funding for climate-related programs in the reconciliation legislation, which we'll talk about in just a minute, he's laid out a couple of very ambitious policy goals on this front. First, in April, as some of you may remember, Biden promised to cut emissions of greenhouse gases in the United States by at least half by 2030. He's going to cut the US greenhouse gas emissions by half in the next 9 years. And that's obviously a very ambitious target that's going to require retooling our entire economy and not going to be easy to do. But then second, just last week, Biden followed up, and the president moved really big on solar power. Because last Wednesday, the Biden administration, as many of you read, released a proposal showing how the US could move from producing almost half of its electricity from the sun by 2050, which would be a huge step toward fighting climate change, and obviously one that would require immense upgrades to the electric grid. So cutting greenhouse gases in half by 2030, getting half of our nation's power from solar energy by 2050, those are pretty big goals. What do you think? Claire, can we see our next question? So can Biden do this? Will the US achieve his climate goals by 2030? Option one, yes, we will, and with room to spare. It won't be that hard. We're almost halfway there now from Obama's goals set several years ago. Maybe we can finish the job in the next 9 years. Second, yeah, we're going to make it, but just barely by the skin of our teeth. Third option, no, we're not going to quite get to that 50% reduction, but we're going to get close to it. Or fourth, and finally, not a chance. There's no way we get even close. It's just simply not a realistic goal. So what all of you think? Wow. 4% of you think that we'll get to that goal easily. An additional 34% say that we'll get there, but more barely. So 38%, only a little bit more than a third of our group, think we're going to achieve that climate goal by the end of this decade, whereas almost 2/3 of you say it's not going to happen, whether close or by a larger margin. Very interesting. Let's go to the second question. And this one isn't about greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. It's about will we be able to achieve Biden's solar energy goals, getting half of our nation's power from solar energy by 2050? Same choices here. Yes, with room to spare. Yeah, but just by a little bit. We'll just barely make it. No, but it's going to be close. And no, yeah, it's a moonshot. It's just simply not going to happen. And I realize that 2050 is a long way off, so asking you to predict that far into the future isn't particularly fair. But just for fun, I want to see if you're more optimistic on this one than you are on the first. And look at that. Interesting, you're a little bit more optimistic on the 2050 solar goal than you were on the more immediate one. 58% of you, more than a half, believe we'll make that goal by 2050. And only 42% of you say no. Very, very interesting. Now I'm going to tell you this. There is almost no precedent for expanding solar energy at those levels. Last year, solar energy was less than 4% of the country's electricity. And so if we're going to achieve that goal, the country is going to have to double the amount of solar energy installed every year over the next 4 years, and then double it again by 2030. So that's not me saying it can't happen, not at all, but just saying that if we're going to get to that goal, we've got to take most of the steps to get there by the end of this decade. But for either of these goals to happen, either reducing emissions by 50% by 2030 or getting solar power to be half of our energy supply by 2050, those two steps rely very, very heavily on two really important policy proposals that the Biden administration has forwarded that haven't gotten nearly as much attention as they deserve. And I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about what those two proposals are before we go to your questions. The first proposal, and this is in the reconciliation package that Democrats are hoping to pass, even without Republican votes. The first is a proposal for clean energy tax initiatives, tax incentives. Clean energy tax incentives, and there's nothing fancy about this at all. You just use the tax code to incentivize consumers to start using renewables a lot more frequently. There are tax credits in this proposal for renewable energy, like solar power and nuclear power, and for renewable fuels, like biodiesel and for clean hydrogen, for getting homes and businesses to run on green energy, for buying electric vehicles so they can be as affordable as gas-powered cars, for electric bicycles. So one way of doing this, the big ticket item for the Biden administration is tax incentives, tax credits for people who are willing to take these steps when it comes to renewable energies. Now, the biggest concern from progressives is one I alluded to earlier. Right now, there's $235 billion in that reconciliation package for those kind of tax incentives. But if the size of the package gets whittled down, well, then there's less for those incentives. The biggest concern for moderates, and this is worth keeping an eye on too, is the electric vehicle tax incentives are not means tested. That means that wealthy Americans can use the credits to subsidize the purchase of the more expensive Teslas and the other very expensive electric cars. And that's a political attack that Republicans have been using against vulnerable House Democrats. The second proposal, this is going to sound really wonky, but it's called the Clean Electricity Performance Program. And it sounds a little arcane, but to climate policy experts, this is the big one, even more than the tax incentives. This proposal would pay utilities that switch to clean energy, and it would penalize utilities that don't. Now, here's the problem. Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, who's writing this bill, said on CNN on Sunday, he thinks that this is a really bad idea because switching to clean energy is going to happen, given the private sector incentives, without a push from government. Now, the key to getting Manchin on board is going to run through the United Mine Workers of America, the very powerful union that is extremely powerful in his home state of West Virginia. And not surprisingly, the mine workers oppose the bill. Mine workers and the unions are poised for a huge fight with the environmental community about how fossil fuels can be accommodated in some way in this package without diluting the bill's carbon reduction programs by too much. But if there isn't some accommodation, it's going to be a lot harder, not just to get Manchin, but to get probably about a half and other centrist Democrats as well. My guess is the tax credits are going to be the harder of the two fights. And the reason for that is that this policy affects voters directly, while funding for utilities may impact users' bills, but it's an indirect impact on most people. So it's a little bit more abstract. But when it comes to people's day-to-day decisions on how they live their lives, whether it's electric vehicles or any other type of or solar panels or anything else, that hits right into people's lives. And so that's going to be a very pronounced debate. But on the utility portion, the Democrats need Manchin's vote. And as I said earlier, if he's holding off on this, that means that there's a half a dozen other Senate Democrats who are holding off on it too. They're just not being as loud about it. Now, given that Manchin and other Democrats are raising questions about the overall size of the package, they're saying that $3.5 trillion is just too much. That means that every dollar cut is going to have to come from somewhere. And going back to the question I asked you all a few minutes ago, advocates for healthcare, for education, for criminal justice, and for other spending priorities are going to be fighting just as hard to save their money in the proposal, in the budget, as those who prioritize climate change are going to be fighting. Now, Biden's White House can't get these provisions through Congress unless two wings of their party, environmentalists and labor, can come together. And we'll be watching over the next weeks and probably 2 or 3 months to see whether he can pull that off. But in the bigger fight over budget priorities, keep an eye on the tax cut, on the tax credits, and on the utility proposal, because that's where the real action on climate change is going to be. And more than anything, that's going to determine whether or not we reach those far-reaching goals for 2030 and 2050. Okay, we're right at the bottom of the hour, 60 seconds over, not too bad for the evening. So Jessica, if you can put aside happy hour for a moment. Oh, there you are. Some of our listeners, of our viewers, I know, have started happy hour or not, but I'm glad that you're holding off for another half an hour. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, we'll see how these questions go. Hopefully they're, we'll see. The first question, can you comment on the disclosure that General Milley acted to prevent a nuclear war?
Sorry, Jessica, can you repeat that? You cut out for just 1 second somehow.
Oh, my apologies. Can you comment on the disclosure that General Milley acted to prevent a nuclear war? I think this is coming from the Bob Woodward book.
Yes, I could tell the question was about Milley. I just wanted to make sure I heard the question precisely, because for those of you who have not yet read today's news coverage about Bob Woodward and Robert Costa's new blockbuster book, there's any number of extraordinary revelations, many referencing directly the then and current chair of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley. General Milley was confronted by a very angry and very worried Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who postulated that she felt that Trump had become mentally unstable in the weeks since the election. And Milley, at least according to Costa and Woodward's account, did not argue with that. And in fact, as Woodward and Costa report in this new book, not just on one, but on 2 occasions, one shortly after the election and one a couple days after the January 6th insurrection, Milley actually took the steps of calling his Chinese counterpart to let him know that if anything particularly peculiar seemed to be happening out of Washington, that they should communicate. And General Milley, was attempting to reassure the Chinese military leadership that despite the kind of language Trump was using, that did not mean a war. As many of you know, famously, back at the depths of Watergate, then Defense Secretary Schlesinger went to the military's top generals and said that if President Nixon asked for the nuclear codes in order to launch an attack, that they should come to him, Schlesinger, as well, which is technically not the way the process is supposed to work. But given his concerns about President Nixon's psychological state at that time, he felt it was the prudent thing to do. It's been conjectured on a number of occasions that General Milley came to the same conclusion. There's no way of knowing. We'll never know whether Trump would have taken extremely dramatic steps, military action, or even something beyond in the last weeks of his presidency. But we do know that General Milley was sufficiently concerned about that possibility that he took steps that were very, very out of the ordinary. And this book is going to be just a fascinating read.
Do you think that Biden showing up in Long Beach on the eve of the recall will have any effect on the outcome? Millions of votes were mailed in already.
I don't think so. Not only have millions of votes already been mailed in, for those of you who are not from California, I think you do know that our recall election concludes tonight in just a couple of hours. But you may not be aware that our state has very, very expansive vote by mail opportunities. Every registered voter does get a mail ballot, and those are not only able to be sent in by the U.S. Postal Service, but to be left at drop boxes around the state for the weeks heading up to the election. And not a majority, but if a large plurality of ballots have already been cast. And while it would be risky to assume that every registered Democrat voted against the recall and every registered Republican voted for it, the very large percentage of Democratic ballots that have been returned, we don't know how people voted, but we know who voted. So we know that the number of Democrats who voted is much, much larger than the number of Republicans. What that essentially meant is that by last night, when President Biden came to California, and judging about what we've been seeing in public opinion polls over the last couple of weeks, his visit probably didn't make much of a difference at all. But it was a prudent thing for both Newsom and Biden to have the event anyway. It was prudent for Newsom because even while it appears that he's going to defeat the recall by a wide margin, the last thing Newsom and his team would want to do at this point would be to take any risk. And if it turned out that the recall passed even by a slim margin, and that a Biden visit could have helped motivate loyal Democrat voters, then foregoing that event is a risk that they simply weren't willing to take. But ultimately, I think the visit was more important for Biden than it was for Newsom. Like I said half an hour ago, Biden's had a tough month. And assuming that the recall is defeated, being publicly associated with a high-profile Democratic victory is good for the president politically, and is going to enhance his political stature in taking on the types of issues we've been talking about for the first 30 minutes of this program.
Aren't Biden's low poll numbers indicative of short-term memory of Americans? All of these problems were created by the Trump administration in its campaign to, quote unquote, drain the swamp.
Well, I think one of the truisms of American politics, and the thing about truisms is that they tend to be true, is that almost always the person in charge gets way too much credit when things are good and way too much blame when things are bad. And this is a challenge that every president, that every governor, that every mayor faces. If you inherit a very good situation, you're going to get credit for it, even if you didn't do much to deserve it. If you're handed off a really much more challenging, more difficult set of circumstances, the voters are going to put that blame on you, whether you deserve it or not. Biden's been in politics a long time, and these poll numbers may be frustrating to him. Of course they are. They would be to anyone. But he is enough of a political veteran to understand that when voters are in good moods, they reward the people in charge. When they're in grouchy modes, they punish them. And while Biden himself will not be on the ballot for another 3 years, he does want to improve those poll numbers. One, because it'll help him and his party in the midterm elections next year. But arguably more important, if his poll numbers come up in the months ahead, that probably means that the COVID situation is getting better. And that's good for all of us, regardless of who we vote for.
Was Biden's mandate policy an example of owning the conservatives, a reversal of the Trump tactics of owning the liberals?
It's a really smart question. It's a very savvy strategic overview of the situation. Biden tried hard to avoid that more confrontational brand of politics. He believes, and it appears genuinely, that the type of politics that were practiced through the early parts of his career, where the two parties could work together when they were needed, is a preferable way for the system to work. And for what it's worth, I happen to agree with that. And so Biden, not just on COVID, but on any number of other issues, has made extra efforts to try to find a way to work with Republicans, not on every issue, but on many issues. And he has been reluctant to criticize, to demonize, to attack the hardcore vaccine resistors or rejectors, because he ultimately believes that in addition to the political conciliation he still hopes can take place, ultimately you're very unlikely to get people to do something that you want them to do that they don't want to do by shaming them. And I think Biden came to the conclusion he did for two reasons. One, politically speaking, he knew that the hardcore resistors were never going to vote for him or his party anyway, so he might as well use them as a foil. He might as well criticize them, even if it drove them further away, in order to win over the political center and more importantly, and here's the Trump overlap, to motivate his own base. Biden is attempting to use his opponent's strongest supporters, the opposition's strongest supporters, to win over swing voters. Trump used that tactic to try to motivate his base, to his own political base, to an even greater degree. So it's not an approach that Biden came to naturally. It seems to be one he came to reluctantly, but it seems to be one we're going to be seeing from him, at least on COVID, for some time. Real quick, and I apologize, Jessica, I said that there were two reasons he did it. One was the politics I just mentioned, but the second, I think, was for health reasons also. Along with the hardcore vax rejectors, there's a lot of resistors out there who haven't gotten the vaccine yet, but still might. I think what Biden is trying to do is to drive a wedge between those two cohorts of unvaccinated Americans and to set aside those who reject him out of hand as being extremist. And then in some ways trying to find those who've been moving more slowly to continue to encourage them along. So in other words, he's not tarring all of the unvaccinated with one brush anymore. He's divided them into two groups, knowing that he can't win over the most extreme, but maybe this distinction can help him persuade the resistant, the more reluctant unvaccinated to come around.
How will Biden's mandates affect long-term diversity within America? I also would add long-term division within America.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. As I mentioned, taking this step was a risk because it does deepen the divide between those who've been vaccinated and those who are deeply against it. And that mirrors obviously a very large partisan divide. On the other hand, I think that Biden has come to the conclusion that if COVID continues to rage and the economy continues to struggle, that the nation will divide even more through times of adversity. So what his risk is, what his gamble is that even if his hardcore opponents become even more vociferous in their dismissal and their denunciations of him, if he can put this country back on a better track as it relates to health and as it relates to the economy, that will have more of a unifying effect. So it's a short-term risk in order to get a longer-term payoff. But his conclusion, it seems, has been that if he didn't take this step, he might not anger his strongest opponents quite as much. But if he didn't take a step like this one, he'd never improve the situation substantively enough to bring the country back together.
Why is Congress exempt from the Biden COVID vaccine mandate?
I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think they should be. It defies logic. I think if you want to protect the health of Americans, then we'd want to protect the health of our elected representatives. I'll admit that I have read about the exemption. I'm not aware of the reasons for it, but I don't think it's appropriate, and hopefully it's something that will be addressed going forward.
What should be done with members of the LA Sheriff, Police, and Fire Department who don't want to get a vaccine?
This is a tough one, and we're seeing that there are not just hundreds, but thousands of LAPD officers, Los Angeles sheriffs, and other public servants throughout the Southland who are resisting the vaccine, and we're seeing similar reactions in other parts of the country as well. My own feeling is that for law enforcement and for other critical positions like that, I would be willing, as many local and state governments have done, to compromise. Say, if you don't want to get the vaccine, the overwhelming number of those who are saying they don't want to get it are saying they are not doing it for either religious or medical reasons, whether that's legit or not. Say, all right, if you are willing to get tested on a very frequent basis, more than once a week, you'll be able to maintain your position. But the real difficulty here for any community is that if we were to simply force all police officers, all teachers, all other critical employees who simply refused to leave their positions, it would expose our communities in all sorts of other dangerous ways. So while it's not an ideal situation, allowing for the testing option does seem, at least to me, to be the most reasonable way to reconcile those two very difficult opposing goals.
Why are Republicans benefiting from the continuing COVID pandemic when their anti-vaccine and anti-mask policies are causing, or at least contributing to, the summer surge?
Well, I don't know that Republicans are benefiting. I suppose that if Biden's poll numbers are falling, then by definition in the zero-sum game, that's good for Republicans. But I don't know if that's the type of dynamic that can sustain through midterm elections. Now, I'll preface this comment by saying that I acknowledge that California is obviously a very, very Democratic state. You've heard me say before that our state has gone from being deep blue to indigo over the last several years. But that said, watching the way Newsom has run his campaign, I think will be very instructive to Democratic candidates in other parts of the country and in swing states around the country next year. And let me explain what I'm saying by this. So the recall election wouldn't have taken place if it weren't for the coronavirus. There had been several efforts to recall him that started right after he'd been elected on issues of homelessness, on issues of immigration, on other issues. None had come close to qualifying. It wasn't until last fall or last winter, at the height of the shutdown, during the governor's visit to the very expensive restaurant and his concurrent call for Californians to avoid those kind of social gatherings, that the recall gathered steam in order to qualify. Through the winter, it looked like he was in really big trouble. But over the last several weeks, when Trump's poll numbers have improved, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the reason Newsom's poll numbers have improved is because voters who back last spring thought he was doing a horrible job on the pandemic have changed their mind. Last spring, most public opinion polling showed that roughly a third of Californians gave Newsom a favorable rating on his handling of the coronavirus. Polls in the last couple of weeks show that that number has roughly doubled. Now, part of that is because we have vaccines now, which means the most onerous measures that state government is calling for are no longer shutdowns and stay-at-home orders. It's mask mandates, and so that is a lot less. Controversial. But what Newsom has done very effectively is he has contrasted his approach with governors of more conservative states who've taken the opposite approach on COVID. And what Newsom has done, even in deep blue California, I believe it's an approach that Democrats in other parts of the country will try, potentially succeed at, is Newsom ran in this recall election not just against Donald Trump and Larry Elder, he ran against the states of Florida and Texas. And what he said to the voters in this state is, would you really want to be having the caseloads, the hospitalizations, the deaths that they're seeing in those other states? And Californians seem to be responding by pretty large margins. No, that's not what we want. So in a swing state, a state like Ohio, a state like Wisconsin, a state like Pennsylvania, where the state is more politically balanced than California's political landscape, that's not going to move as many voters, but it is going to be a very effective way of motivating a Democratic base. And one of the things we know from history is that unlike presidential elections, which are about persuading undecided voters, midterm elections are about motivating a party's most loyal supporters. Generally speaking, a president's party loses seats in midterm elections because that president's supporters are not as motivated as his opponents. If Biden can get the Democratic base as motivated in key swing states as Newsom has here, the rewards that some Republicans may be seeing in the short term may not be enough to sustain them. That's not me predicting a Democrats keeping control of Congress next year. It's way too early for that. But I think it's also way too early to assume that Biden's drop in the polls right now is going to manifest itself into long-term benefits for Republicans. It could, but it's going to be a while before we know for sure.
Even if Congress passes a climate bill, how will they get companies to lower their emissions?
So the real key for Congress is not just incentives for private sector companies to lower their emissions, but public utilities. And what they'll do in both cases, presumably with greater effect with utilities, but with private sector companies as too, as I was talking about earlier, is to offer incentives. So if Jessica Duganzik Incorporated, Global Duganzik Worldwide, decides that it wants to shift from fossil fuels to some reliance on solar and wind power, you'll realize a very considerable tax benefit, a very considerable tax credit. And if you decide not to, what's going to happen for private sector companies, but to an even greater degree for utilities, is you'll be financially penalized. And that's going to cost the US Treasury a lot of money, because they believe, I think correctly, that a lot more utilities and a lot more private companies are going to take advantage of these incentives than not. But that's why the overall dollar figure in the reconciliation package becomes so important, because the lower that figure goes, the more difficult it becomes to accomplish those tax set-asides, and the more intense the fight becomes between setting aside money for climate change, setting aside money for healthcare, setting aside money for other issues. But the belief is, again, and I once again do think it's a correct one, is that if you offer companies enough money to incentivize them to switch, that doesn't guarantee it, but makes them more likely to do so. Manchin's argument is that this is a shift that we're already beginning to see in the utility industry without tax incentives. But interestingly, he's not arguing against it. He's just saying we don't have to pay the companies to do it.
What about the movement of other Western nations to put in a carbon border tax? With this happening now, if we don't tax carbon at its source here in the US, we will fall way behind in global economic vitality.
Well, there's actually similar conversations going on in the US about imposing a tariff on goods that are produced in other countries in a non-climate sensitive way. My own personal feeling, and as you guys know, I try to keep my own ideological opinions out of this program. But what I will say is, to me, as an avowed free trader, I think this is another form of protectionism. And while I'm a big believer that we do need to work more aggressively to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I don't know if putting up protectionist trade barriers, even in the name of environmental protection, is a reasonable trade-off. That said, there's a lot of very, very smart people who disagree with me and say that while protectionism might not be an ideal approach for economic success, the imperative of fighting climate change is so important. It's worth doing here. But I suspect that even in a global political environment in which free trade is becoming more and more challenging, in which isolationism is becoming more and more appealing, I don't see a lot of these, for lack of a better term, climate tariffs taking effect, either ingoing or outgoing.
Since China will not participate in efforts to achieve climate goals, and since they are the main polluters and hence contribute greatly to world pollution, won't climate change be likely to be irreversible if our country is one of the few countries trying to take care of this issue?
So it's a very, very important point. And Jessica, I think we're overdue to have a China discussion in our webinar. It's been a couple months, if I'm not mistaken, and all sorts of topics relating to China have begun to stack up. And this is a critically important one. In my own opinion, the most undercovered news story of the week, this past week, was John Kerry's visit to China. Kerry, of course, is President Biden's climate change emissary. And he went there under the belief that climate change would be an issue that he could negotiate with the Chinese separately than all the other matters on which the two sides are arguing. And that's something that the Chinese had indicated back when Biden was inaugurated. First of all, Kerry was pretty much humiliated in China. Even though Chinese government officials had been meeting in person with any number of mid-level and lower-level functionaries, my understanding is they met only with Biden by video, as opposed to an in-person meeting. His meetings were not with people of a similar rank to his, but he was told in this meeting, after being snubbed in China, that in fact climate change considerations could be impacted by the relationship between the US and China on human rights issues, on economic issues, on security issues, and so on. And that presents a very, very large obstacle going forward, not just for efforts to fight climate change globally, but on a whole range of other issues as well. Because while it makes the climate negotiations, as the questioner correctly noted, much more difficult, it reflects a belligerence on the part of the Chinese that goes beyond even what we'd seen earlier in the year. So not good news on either or any front, and one that we will delve into in more detail at some point over the next few weeks.
How important has public outcry been in convincing the Senate Finance Committee to include carbon pricing? It wasn't there a month ago. Now there are 3 options being considered.
I don't know that direct public outcry is what's caused the Senate to change its thinking on this, but I do believe that public opinion polling that shows how much more of a priority this issue has become to a much greater swath, not just of loyal Democratic voters, but to swing voters, has had some effect on them as well. So I wouldn't suggest that it's all being done for political reasons. One of the other reasons we're seeing this movement, as I said earlier, in order to achieve Biden's broader climate goals, we're going to need to see the environmental community and organized labor coming to understanding, at least on some measures. One of the reasons we've seen some progress in the Senate on this issue is because even though there's still a wide gulf that separates progressives from moderates in the Democratic Party on these issues, they have been able to make a decent amount of progress, and that's been reflected in the change in the legislative direction.
It appears today the recall proponents are going to lose badly, and moderate Republicans will be reduced to single digits. What does this mean for the Republican Party?
Well, the polls don't close for a couple more hours, just to cover myself on this one. But if the recall is defeated by a sizable margin, that's a problem for Republicans. That's a problem for Republicans for 2 reasons. One, it means they missed an opportunity to remove a governor from office who had done some very controversial and unpopular things. And they sacrificed that opportunity for all sorts of reasons that we don't have time to get into with our remaining minutes. But second, if the results do come out at least somewhat in line with recent public opinion polls, it appears that Larry Elder, the radio talk show host, will not just finish first on the second question, but by a very, very large margin over the more traditional Republican types. And especially for Kevin Faulconer, the former mayor of San Diego, who had been preparing a campaign for governor before the recall qualified, and who, in my opinion, was forced to get in this recall whether he wanted to or not, just because it would have been very difficult to run for governor next year if he had sat out this year. Faulconer's gubernatorial prospects are going to be severely harmed by the likely outcome of this recall election. And the only person who will be happier about that than Larry Elder is Gavin Newsom. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. When Newsom told his supporters not to vote on the second question, he said, vote no on question 1 and then go home. One of the reasons for that that's been commonly discussed in the news media and elsewhere is because Newsom and his team felt that steering his supporters to a candidate on the second question would be too confusing. But the other reason for telling his supporters to lay off is that Newsom and his advisors knew very well that if the most progressive voters in California don't vote on the second question, that means that the candidates who will benefit are the most conservative ones. And the better Elder does in tonight's balloting, and the worse that Faulconer does, the more of a victory that is for a more Trump-leaning wing of the state Republican Party. And the more defeat, the greater defeat it is for what I don't think we'll call the moderate, but what we'll call pre-Trump traditional conservatives. That's not to say that Faulconer can't run for governor next year. It's not to say that a relatively traditional conservative can't mount a competitive campaign. But if he suffers the kind of defeat in the recall tonight that it appears is going to be the case, it's going to look like the faction of the Republican Party that has supported Donald Trump and is now supporting Larry Elder will continue to be preeminent in California politics. Whether we can extrapolate from that lesson here in deep blue California on a national level is a conversation for another day, and it's another topic we'll have to add in the future. not only what we can learn about the California recall election in terms of national Republican prospects going forward, but an even bigger conversation about the future of the two parties. But at least for tonight, let's argue that while there are very, very few moderate Republicans left in California, the more traditional Romney-Bush type of conservatives that Kevin Faulconer represented are in all likelihood going to suffer a very big defeat tonight, which is going to make their challenges next year much, much greater.
Well, I don't know if you just felt it a couple of minutes ago while you were giving your remarks, but there was a small earthquake. So if you guys all saw my eyes get really big, hopefully that doesn't say that things are going to shake up anymore in California. But Dan, thank you for another great discussion. If I can ask you one question, what did you think of AOC's Met Gala dress?
I probably would not have worn it, but she certainly made a big statement with it.
Yes, she did. Awesome. Well, to our audience, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Great question, Jessica. I love it. Dan, thank you as always for helping to navigate us through all of these complex issues. We have a great audience tonight, so it looks like the 5 o'clock slot is working. So thank you all for joining us.
That's great news. And my guess is that for people who enjoyed their happy hour while they were listening to our conversation, maybe that's the best of both worlds.
So Dan, let's close it by just doing a quick update on some of our upcoming programs. Tomorrow, we have a terrific program on the remarkable odyssey of Angela Merkel. Of course, Dan, next week, Tuesday at 5 p.m. September 23rd, The Future of Money with Frank Motek. And then in October, we have 2 terrific programs that we'll be posting very soon. October 15th, Fiona Hill with moderator Doyle McManus from the Los Angeles Times. And on the 15th, we'll be hosting a talk with retired 4-star General Stanley McChrystal. It will be a continuation a bit of our Afghanistan coverage. So please go to our website at lawacth.org and register today. Make a donation, become a member. We appreciate anything you can do. Everybody take care, stay safe. Dan, thanks so much.